Hello and welcome to AP Environmental Science. Hopefully you guys have your textbooks out, your post-it notes, and something to write with. We are starting with Chapter 1, titled The Environment and Sustainability. And in this chapter, we're hoping to get a nice overview of some of these concepts here. We want to better understand what environmental science is, what the concept of sustainability entails, how humans impact our environment, and how human and natural systems are interacting. And then ultimately how our economy and government can play a role in these interacting systems. So let's get started. So on page 4, you will find our first case study titled The Tragedy of the Commons, and these two terms are both very important to know and understand. So let's start with the idea of sustainability. It's defined in this case study, so make sure you're familiar with the definition, and it's basically this concept of how do we manage our resources so our kids and our grandkids can have a good life? How can we be smart and efficient with how we do things on our planet? So this idea of sustainability was first published in a document that the United Nations pushed out in 1987 titled Our Common Future. And it was basically an effort to educate everyone of our planet that we need to be mindful of how we are interacting with natural systems on our planet. And that sustainability is basically a concept where we need to protect and use our natural resources rationally. How can we protect nature and the environment so that we can interact with these systems in a way that's sustainable, that's long-lasting, and doesn't have long-term impacts and implications down the road? So make sure you're familiar with sustainability. Next, let's dive into this term, tragedy of the commons, also a very important term for you to know and understand. Tragedy of commons is covered in this case study with an example of the Atlantic codfish. And this is an idea that when we have open access to some kind of resource, we often see that it is abused and used unsustainably if we don't have it regulated. So make sure you take time reading about this case study and how over time the amount of fish that was pulled out of the Atlantic Ocean all of a sudden increased due to some technological advances, and then we see this huge depletion of this resource. So we can apply this idea of tragedy of commons to a lot of common pool resources like the atmosphere or freshwater environments or forests. So be familiar with this concept, know how it applies to different renewable resources, and also be mindful of possible solutions on how we can avoid getting in this situation of this lose-lose situation of tragedy of the commons. And next up, we have some key terms that are important for you guys to know. Some of them you might already be familiar with from biology, but let's talk about environmental science. So this is a scientific practice where we're executing experiments and doing labs and inquiry, where we're applying our understandings to better understand this interaction between human systems and Earth's natural systems. So that's what environmental science is. In order to unpack this term, it's going to be important that you guys have knowledge of these key terms. So take a look at the glossary at the end of the chapter on page 25 for your reference. Also honing in on the main concepts of this chapter, section 1.1 is important for you to reference as well. So in this chapter, we are learning about the principles of sustainability. And on this page, we see the first three principles. We have solar energy, chemical cycling, and biodiversity. And it's important to understand how each of these play a role in helping our planet achieve sustainability and maintain it over time. So we know that solar energy is our input of energy. Chemical cycling allows for us to move these nutrients around in different usable forms for living organisms to use them. And biodiversity is another important term for you to know, and its role in sustainability. Also of note are the 2 dates that we have written over here. So know that the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years, according to scientific research. And of that lifetime of our planet, it's been able to sustain life on itself for 3.8 billion years. And we'll see in the very last part of that 3.8 billion years, humans populate our planet and have a huge impact. So next up, we have a diagram on page 7, figure 1.3, which maps out some more important key terms. So know that natural capital is made up of natural resources and ecosystem services. If you look at this diagram, they're categorized by color. So you guys are familiar with natural resources, soil, water, air, land, and so on. And it's these ecosystem services that are generated that help all living organisms, not just ourselves, but help all living organisms exist on our planet. So take a look at those and understand how those interact to ultimately generate natural capital. Next, if you take a look at the diagram 1.4 down below, you'll see that the natural resources can be categorized into one of 3 different categories. So we have inexhaustible, renewable, and non-renewable resources. And for this figure, you guys should be familiar with all 3 categories, be able to describe what type of resource is categorized in each of those, and know some examples. So inexhaustible resources are these that we can use as much as we want, and we don't risk depleting them because of the rate at which we're using them. For renewable resources, we have to be careful because we could use them too quickly, even though they are regenerating. If we chop down trees quicker than they can grow, we're going to be depleting that precious renewable resource. For non-renewable, once they're used, they're gone because it takes such a long time for those types of resources to regenerate. So next up, we have an overview of what ecosystem services are. So be familiar with the definition. Basically, these are benefits that are created by nature and interacting natural systems that allow us to live along with other living organisms, and it supports our economy. So know some examples of ecosystem services and how the natural environment produces these different things. So if you think of a forest is something that allows us to have clean air. So through photosynthesis, it is removing carbon dioxide and adding oxygen into the air. It is purifying the water. So think of the tree as like a sponge, and it's soaking up the water and releasing it back into the environment. It's helping with nutrient cycling. So we already talked about how carbon is cycled a little bit. It helps decrease soil erosion. It helps regulate climate and so much more. So know that these natural systems produce ecosystem services that help other living organisms survive. In this section, you'll be introduced to this concept that you're probably familiar with, is that humans can impact the environment and compromise some of these natural systems. So we as humans, we use these resources, we can add pollution and waste into the environment. Ultimately, as humans, we have the ability to degrade these the natural capital that our planet has. So if you think about this forest, we know that deforestation is a very common problem on our planet, and it's such a problem that we really are going to take a closer look at it later in this course. But if we chop down these forests and remove them to plant monocultural crops, we're eliminating some of those ecosystem services that these trees could otherwise be providing. So another thing this chapter introduces you to are the solutions, or challenges you to think of the solutions that we could roll out to help prevent resources from being degraded. So a solution to deforestation would include maybe passing or placing laws that help protect forests or stop the burning of trees or cutting them down. So we are going to keep revisiting the ideas of solutions and how government can help push our way in which we interact with our planet in a more sustainable direction. So be able to apply this concept to different scenarios. So if you think back to our case study with the fish, a solution to prevent tragedy of the commons happening in the ocean might be to produce some fishing quota or regulation as to how much fish could be pulled out during a certain time of the year. Maybe we want to protect certain marine areas and make MPAs, or marine protected areas. There's a whole different variety of ways we could approach these different situations. On the next page, we have the 3 remaining principles of sustainability. In this diagram, we can see that our economy, politics, and ethics play a role in achieving sustainability. So these are principles that can help transition us to move toward a more environmentally and economically sustainable future. And if we break each of these down, economics. So here we would have the idea of full cost pricing that would incorporate the true cost of a good or service into the cost that is being sold for. So even though plastic water bottles are very available and very cheap and affordable, a $1 plastic water bottle might not be a true reflection of the impact that plastic water bottle has on the environment. So think of, we're using plastic that's made by fossil fuels. We're probably transporting it across the globe, introducing pollution. And if we were to incorporate full cost pricing into this item, we wouldn't be looking at a $1 bottle, it would be a lot more. And that's because of the impact this water bottle has on the environment. So getting these goods and services more appropriately priced would encourage people who are shopping around. They would be pushed toward a more sustainable approach if those costs were truly reflecting environmental impacts. Politics plays a role in achieving sustainability as well. So here we dive into what a win-win situation is. Here it would be maybe a company who is transitioning toward a more sustainable model. Maybe they transition from a building or factory that's introducing a lot of pollution into the environment to something that is more efficient and only introducing a little bit of carbon dioxide into the environment. Maybe they're given a tax break for not having such a large ecological footprint. So that would be a win-win, because not only does this company win because they're given money, but also the environment wins. And finally, we have this whole ethical idea of we have a responsibility to not ruin our planet for future generations. We are then asking ourselves what's right, what's wrong, how can we live in a sustainable way where our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids also have a high quality of life. So it comes back to this idea. I love quoting my mom. She always says, leave it better than you found it. And that's the idea here of what are our responsibility to the future generations. In the next section, we get introduced to the idea that environmental impact is not the same across the board on our globe. It's actually divided into, or varies across the spectrum based on industrialization. So we have countries on our planet that are more developed, such as our own country, the United States. where the average income per person is quite high. So these individuals are bringing in a lot of money, as opposed to less developed countries, a lower average income per person. So know some examples of countries that fall into these different categories, and know that it's the more developed countries that tend to have a higher environmental impact than less developed. So although the less developed countries make up 83% of our global population, their global impact is not 83%. Their impact is closer to 30%. And that comes back to this idea of the amount of industrialization that exists in that country, along with other variables as well. And lastly, in this section 1 of chapter 1, we have this look into a new term called biomimicry. And this is an idea that may provide us some solutions to achieving and maintaining sustainability on our planet. So it's this idea that we're going to learn from nature. Our planet has been able to sustain life on itself successfully for 3.8 billion years. Why can't we do that now? And it looks into what nature has in place that allows it to exist in a sustainable system on our planet. In our next section, chapter 1, section 2, we take a look at ecological footprints and how they impact our planet. So this is taking a look into different countries, whether they're industrialized or not. Again, we see that the more industrialized the country, the larger the ecological footprint is. And although we have a large ecological footprint, there are some pros and cons to the situation. So the good of it, which is explained in this first section, is that with industrialization comes a higher quality of life. We now have access to clean resources like clean drinking water. We can build habitats or shelters. We have healthcare systems. So there's a lot of good that comes with it that allows us to live a higher quality of life. But of course, the bad is that it's not sustainable, because with all of those different pieces of technology, we are manipulating the environment in a not so sustainable way. So we are introducing pollution into natural resources. We are using the resources at a quicker rate than they can regenerate, so we're depleting them. So the idea is that it's not sustainable. We can't live this way forever. And this is the process known as environmental degradation or natural capital degradation. So if you look at this diagram, figure 1.7, you can see all the different impacts humans are having on the environment. We're polluting the air. We're causing the soil to be eroded at a very quick rate. We are pumping fresh water out of aquifers faster than it can replenish itself. We are polluting the water. The list goes on. So know that humans are a very dominant animal on our planet, and we have an astronomically high impact on the environment, which right now it's not sustainable. On this next page, I want you to spend some time looking at this figure 1.8 up here and see if you can find some patterns. So know that ecological footprints is a measure of how severely we are impacting the environment based off of human lifestyle and consumption. And it's measured as a percent here, a spectrum. So the very darker colors would be a high ecological footprint, and take a look and see where you can find these colors on the map and see if you can figure out some patterns. Where is there a low ecological footprint? Where is there a high ecological footprint? And where that falls on this map. So next we go into a section on how humans are using the land, and we have land divided into two categories, and there's information about each of these in the reading. So we know that private land is pretty much used in whichever way the owner or individuals and businesses want to use them. So we have farms, livestock, We could be harvesting lumber. That's what happens on private land. It's the public land that is more protected and regulated through all these different systems managed by the government. So take a look at the examples and categories of land and how it is owned by different public agencies and what their main goal is. In the next section, we have some terms that allow us to continue unpacking this idea of human impact. So it's important to understand this term biocapacity, which is the ability of an ecosystem to regenerate the renewable resources that are being consumed by people in that area or a population. So we can measure the amount of impact a human population is having on a given environment by taking a look at the per capita ecological footprint, and know that we are seeing over time an increase in ecological footprints in general across our whole globe. And if everyone were to continue living the way at which that we're living according to 2012 rates, we would not only need just our planet, but we would need a whole nother half of a planet. We would need 1.5 Earths to achieve sustainability at the rate at which we're living, using our resources, polluting the environment, and so on. So we'll take a closer look at ecological footprints in a later unit, but just know that humans are impacting the environment, and that impact can be measurable. And there are different ways we can measure them. There's an IPAT equation, which is given here in your textbook, and this is another way to measure environmental impacts using different variables that considers the amount of people in an area, so the population. It also considers affluence in a given area, so the amount of resources that are being consumed per person. So very wealthy nations are going to have a high consumption. And then finally, technology. And this last variable, technology, can either help or hurt the amount of impact. So we have technology that introduces pollution into the environment, but then we also have other sources of or types of technology that could benefit environmental impacts. So the incorporation of solar panels might be a benefit or impact this equation in a more positive way. So it could go both ways for that last variable. Next, our section looks at some historical events that include some cultural shifts that have changed our ecological footprint over time. So it's really important to know these events and know these dates. So we know that the agricultural revolution, where we were able to transition from more of a hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle to a mass food production lifestyle, happened 10,000 years ago. So be familiar with that date, along with the industrial medical revolution. And this was when we started inventing and using machines to mass produce different goods and services, along with some advances in the medical industry, which significantly increased life expectancy of various populations. And then finally, we have the information globalization revolution that occurred or started to occur in the 1960s, 1970s. And this was when we started developing and using technologies that allowed us to share information and resources across the whole globe. And all these revolutions collectively are contributing to our changing ecological footprint on the national level and on the global level. So know the impacts and consequences of each of these revolutions on the environment. And the final revolution that this book proposes is the sustainability revolution, which is a period that we are currently in now, where more and more people and more countries are starting to invest more time, energy, and money into better understanding how we can transition to more sustainable lifestyles.